Okay, greetings everyone. This is Josh with Big Slick Adventures, and this is episode 2 of the Horror Hangout. And tonight's guest is from Montreal, Canada, the lovely Kerri Lague. She is the writer of the book Raptured, which came out last year. And Kerri, like myself, was a debut author last year as well. So we both kind of released our books within about a month of each other. So Kerri, did you go ahead and do like, was it the self-publishing route in your case?
Yeah, I did. I wanted my story to be what I wanted it to be, and I did want an editor, and I did have um, a writing consultant, let's say, someone with a little bit more experience than me that helped me identify any certain problems or my strengths, weaknesses, things like that. Um, but yeah, it was quite an adventure. I really enjoyed reading the first book. Can't wait to get to the rest of them.
Oh yeah, for sure. So what made you decide, hey, I would like to be a writer? What kind of motivated you for that?
Well, it wasn't so much wanting to be a writer. That was always kind of an abstract idea for me. What I really wanted to do was I wanted to read the story that I wrote. I have always done a lot of reading, and I always wanted a story just like this one, and was never able to find it anywhere. The closest I ever got was like Stephen King's The Stand is very comparable to this story and was one of my favorite books. Um, but I've never read anything quite like this. I've never seen anything that's quite a comp title to exactly what I've done with the story.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned this, Stan, because this book does have pretty much a biblical tone to it. So why don't you tell the audience about what Raptured is really about?
Yeah, so it's a book about the end of times, everything from the rapture, the 7 years of tribulation, all the way up to Armageddon and the apocalypse. Now, book one is multiple POV. You have seven different characters that are all kind of going through the same thing. Um, as the government announces that they've built these luxury fallout shelters for the coming end of days, and the only people that they're admitting to them are children. And so we have multiple POVs because different people take that news in different ways. They deal with it in different ways. They see it from different perspectives. I thought that it was very important to get not too many perspectives, but as many perspectives as I thought was necessary into the story instead of just having it as a singular character and following their journey through it. Um, but yeah, it's going to be something else. The first book doesn't get all the way, obviously, to the biblical apocalypse. We'll have books 4 or 2 through 5 that will do that. But in the first one, we're just focused on the rapture, which is these fallout shelters that the government has built with the church in order to save all these children. And our characters, some of our main characters, are trying to get as many kids to the rapture as they can before everything starts to collapse.
Correct. And you did a terrific job with that. And one thing I had noticed with this story, and this is something that writers sometimes, particularly filmmakers, have a tough time doing, whenever they try to put some sort of social commentary or what have you, they sometimes can come across as pretentious, sometimes it becomes very divisive. In your book, you certainly have, it's definitely a cautionary tale about trusting and having blind faith towards our institutions, whether it's the government, the church, the media, or what have you, something that certainly has resonated for decades, really going back to John Carpenter's They Live is a perfect example. And the way you did it certainly is a very unifying type of message where I think can no matter what your background is, how you voted or if you voted, where you go to church, or even if you go to church, it will resonate, I think, with just about everyone, really, at least 99.9% of the population, anyway.
Yeah, well, that's one of the things that all those groups of people have in common, whether you're talking political or religious. One thing that all these people tend to have in common is fear. They're all running around really afraid of something. And the people that's about the most about they're afraid are usually the ones that are the most afraid. And when it comes to this story, there's so many crossroads that our characters face that seem like a decision that you can make off the top of your head. Oh, well, this is what I do. But in most cases, you'll see that although that's what the characters usually ultimately do, it doesn't always turn out for them. So the first answer that comes to your head and the knee jerk reaction that you have to certain things is not always the best one. And I think that our a few of our characters learn very hard lessons that way and will continue to throughout the rest of the stories.
Yeah, and I'm really interested in seeing what happens to the character of Jake, who, you know, I don't want to give any spoiler alert to those who haven't read the book, but something happens to him, and then we don't know what happens until the very end of your book. And I'm really excited to see what happens with that character, plus the character that he's with, let's say, and
Yes.
see how that unfolds. Because I'm kind of thinking you're going to go one way with it, but then again, you might surprise me. So,
Oh, I'm definitely going to surprise you. But yeah, there's that is one very interesting storyline. I There are a couple of characters in the first book that might seem more like minor characters, especially in the first book, but their character arcs are going to take a little bit longer to flourish than some
mm-hmm.
of our other characters, where I had to get some character arcs off the ground in the first book, right? We need someone to cheer for, someone to root for, someone to root against. But there are going to be a lot of twists and turns throughout the rest of the book that I think a lot of people will not be expecting. Every time you're going to think that you have a hold on where I stand as an author, you're gonna get another turn. Because even for me, I don't always know where I stand. Sometimes I stand on this side, sometimes I stand on that side. All depends on the particular issue. It has nothing to do with me taking any given situation and just whitewashing it. This is what I do, which is which was one of the hardest parts of writing the book. Is that in each of these situations, I think, what should my characters do? What would I do? And although that I know I'm not always the best decision maker, that makes my characters more relatable. Is that not every decision they make is the right one?
Exactly, and that's something too, because I like put myself while reading the book. I was, gosh, what would I do in this situation? Which group would I be with? And I think I came to the realization I would just probably go to Greenland and just stay there and wait for these idiots to fight it out amongst themselves.
Not a
And
terrible plan.
I'm just gonna bring a, just gonna bring a just start my own little cult, I think, and just or a little hippie commune while everyone fights it out. But
Yeah.
one thing interesting, you mentioned Stephen King earlier. Is that your? Would you consider him your favorite author?
Oh, favorite's a hard one. Um, Favorite author depends on my mood.
Right,
Like sometimes I want something a little bit more flowery and romantic, so I'll go with something by Anne Rice. Or if I want something that's a little bit more descriptive and leaves me on the edge of my seat, builds that suspense and it's a slow burn, then I'll go more Stephen King. But like what I read depends more on my mood. But I will say that Stephen King has been very prevalent in my life since I was born. I was named after the book Kerri. So my mother was a
right,
huge Stephen King fan and got me started on it really young. So her name was Holly, and recently Stephen King's most recent book was called Holly. So now
right.
on my bookshelf, I have a first edition copy of Kerri, a first edition copy of Holly, and the first edition copy of my book, all right next to each other. So although I wouldn't say favorite, I would say most prevalent.
Yeah, he has been definitely. I mean, it's hard to argue his impact on horror, both literary and theatrically. And one thing about Stephen King that I think he does the best, and I've only really read a few of his books, but based on the books I've read and the movie adaptations, he does such a terrific job of writing characters that you can relate to in one form or fashion. And that's something that I tried really hard to do in my book that I wrote, was to at least, at the very least, if I could at least get the reader to buy into the characters, and I at least got them hooked halfway, hopefully, and hopefully the story will take care of itself. Because I'm a believer that you can't have a good story without good characters. So, and that's something you did, I think, pretty well in your book, was creating these characters. Did you base these when you're figuring out these characters? Were you basing them on anyone you know, or just kind of combination of maybe people you knew or people you'd like to know almost? And
So, I mean, different characters represent different things. I will say that each character, all of them, have a small piece of me in each of them. But um, my favorite characters are my more complicated ones, and my more complicated ones are not so much people that I know, but a compilation of bits and pieces of people I know. For example, Amos is one of my favorite characters, and it's because he's not perfect. He's an asshole. He we'll learn more about
funny
why
asshole though.
he is a funny asshole, and but that's the thing, is that we'll learn more about why Amos is the way he is as the story goes along. But suffice it to say, for the first book, he's just an asshole, and I find that it makes him more intriguing because you some of the reactions that you get from him throughout the book are not the reactions that you would expect because of the kind of asshole he is. And the same goes for a couple of characters that maybe we haven't seen some surprising things from yet, but we will as we go along. Lilith is one of them that we will see some interesting things happen for Lilith. But again, she's just a huge bitch, and I just love her for it. I think that you need someone to break that mirror of perfection in your stories because everybody has flaws. So when it comes to some of my characters, I haven't done it for everyone yet, but for some of my characters, I have highlighted those flaws to make them a little bit more relatable because nobody wants to read about, Timmy with the blue eyes and blonde hair that, got straight A's and went to Harvard. Like no one wants to read about that.
Right.
We want to read about Willie who got straight A's until he started smoking crack, flunked out of school, and now he's a pirate. I mean, you know what I but that to the reader, like that's the story you want to hear. You don't want to hear about, the perfect person who had the perfect life and made all the right choices and did all these things. This does not make for a good story. So you need that
Yeah,
conflict.
that's yeah, or else what's the point? It's like
Exactly.
uh and because I mean, do you ever find, and I found this with my book, there were certain character arcs that happened that I had planned on, at least one in particular, but some other character arcs just kind of like happened organically. They just happened naturally as I'm writing, and I'm like looking back, oh, I can't believe I just wrote that. And all of a sudden, I see something funny. Did you have that happen with you? Your writing, or was everything planned, or continues to be planned, or do you foresee changes happening with some of these characters' arcs?
I'm half planner, half pantser. So I know where I want them to end up. How they get there sometimes is a little bit more organic. So I'll go into write a chapter and I'll have a plan. Okay, this is what's going to happen. This is what's going to happen. This is going to happen. And then thing A will happen, and then I'll think, well, that's not how that character would react. And then instead of going to thing B, we go to thing C, and then all of a sudden, by the end of the chapter, I'm like, okay, so none of this happened, and I just throw it out and start with the next one. So overall arc of the story and the series is completely planned. There are certain aspects of character arcs that are completely planned and will come to fruition one way or the other. But there are other parts of the story, like I've had whole characters pop up that I did not expect. Like whole people that just came in where I was like, I need someone here. And here comes this character. And the more I wrote this character, the more I got to like them and the more they ended up in the story. So a good example of that was Marianne.
Mm-hmm.
Marianne is going to end up being a much bigger player in the story than is originally implied in the first story. She's sort of like a B character in the first story, and she'll remain that way for a while. But her character arc is another one that's going to take. It's going to be a slow burn, and it's going to take a little while, but it will have a surprise ending too.
Yeah, what do you find the most for me writing? I sometimes worry about whether or not I'm going to be able through dialogue keep the reader engaged. Not so much my last book, but the current book I'm writing now, I'm having issues trying to get from point A to point B. Have you run into any type of problems that with your writing, or what difficulties have you had so far in writing?
Hmm, I think my biggest difficulty is I'm obsessive about everything tying up, everything meaning something, everything coming like going on to the next point. So for me, I'll be looking at something that happens in a scene and I'll be like, is this getting me anywhere? And then I'll take it out and I'll be like, oh, but I need it for this to happen. And then I'll put it back in. And then I'll like take, well, if I do it this way, so I'll take it out. And then like it's a lot of back and forth like that, especially during my editing process. Um, when I write, I just write. I mean, it comes out sometimes it's just complete gibberish, and I'll just write like, 800 words or something like that, and I'll just be like, I don't know, I'll get it on paper and then I'll edit it. Um, so sometimes it comes out like that. Sometimes, you'll have those days where you just stare at the screen and you're not even sure how to start. You're like, I know I need these things to happen, but what's the most effective way to start this in order to pull the reader in? And you just sit there and stare at the screen. When it comes to writer's block, I have a trick for that. Whenever I get really stuck and I'm just not sure where to go with my stories, I watch interviews on YouTube with some of my favorite authors. So Stephen King, Margaret Atwood, George R.R. Martin, J.K. Rowling, like anybody that I can pull some inspiration from. I've watched almost every Stephen King interview there is. I think probably 4 or 5 times. Same thing with J.K. Rowling. Margaret Atwood is a really funny person to interview too, but they give me inspiration. And when I hear how they deal with writer's block and how they kind of have these troubles too, it inspires me to kind of work through it. And so then I'll just be like, fine, I'll just put anything on the paper. I don't care if it makes sense. I don't care if it ties into the rest of the story. I'm just going to get something on paper. I'll move from there. Usually, once I get going, I have like a paragraph or two under my belt, then I'm good to go. But
I'm the same way. I'm like, it always takes me, especially the type of story I'm writing now. This book is really almost like an anthology book where there's basically going to be 5 stories that are all interconnected with each other.
I love
So I'll
that.
get started with and each story might have 2 or 3 chapters in it. And then, so I'll get done. Right now, I'm like, 3 of the 5 stories are now done, but like getting started on the next one because I'm constantly introducing new characters or new, and I'm going to a different time in history. I'm going from present day to 1700s, 1600s, and because it's a vampire story, and it always takes me like 2 days almost to get restarted. Thinking about, I literally spent 2 days trying to figure out, well, should I have this start here or should I wait or start it there? It's just one of those things. And for me, you talk about watching interviews. I have a handful of comfort movies in the horror genre that I will just, anytime I'm like having a bad day or I just need to let loose, I've got about 3 or 4 or 5 movies that I will watch one of them, and it normally settles me down and I'll get back to in the groove, but I'm
Which
pretty much
ones?
a.
Which ones? Like, give me two.
Well, 2 of them would be all right. The first 2 Hellraiser movies,
Okay.
mainly due to some sentimental reasons, and also Halloween 4, and a lot of that has to do with Halloween 4 was the very first R-rated movie I saw in the theaters. I was 14 at the time. And while watching that movie, the preview for Hellraiser 2 came out. So 2 months later, that was my second movie, which I had to sneak in because I knew they were going to card me for that one. So I bought a ticket to a G-rated Christmas movie or whatever and looked at my watch. Okay, time to sneak in and watch that. So that, at the time too, I was going through a rough time, teenage bullshit or whatever, and just watching some of those characters. Um, all right, I'm watching Christy Cotton go to hell and back, literally. If she can do that, then my problems are. I'll get through it. that. So those are a few of the movies
Yeah,
offhand.
I feel that way with The Purge, which is
Yeah.
weird. All of them, I like this by, and I know it's very new school, and I know a lot of my horror friends are like, "That's too new." It's the whole series. It's one of the few horror series that I enjoyed past the third installment because I
hmm
usually find, with the exception of Halloween, the third. What was the third installment? Wasn't that the one with the masks? The Halloween masks or something
Yeah.
like that?
Season of the Witch. Yeah.
Yes, 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 yes. So Halloween was good, like past there, but I find most horror franchises, once you get past the third one, like Saw 3 or Army of Darkness or things like this is like once I get to the third one, they start to lose me. The Purge was the only one that made it past that point. The concept of the Purge itself is so intriguing to me, and the way that they can come at it from so many different angles, the same
hmm
story, but so many different angles and have a whole new story. I thought was just brilliant. But yeah, before we don't talk about old ones, I really love like Evil Dead was always one of my favorite ones. Ash is one of
Yeah.
my favorite horror characters ever. The faces are just, they just kill me every time when I'm having a bad day. Always cheers me up. Never fails.
Oh yeah, and it's ironic when I first decided a little over a year ago. All right, I want to write something, anything. The first thing I actually wrote was just a fan fiction story, just for practice and just have some fun with. And sure enough, it was a crossover story between Hellraiser and Halloween that just kind of made up in my head and
That's
tried to
so
figure
cool.
out how I could make it all make sense in all this. And
I would
that was
read
like
that. Did you put it up somewhere?
It's on my website, and
I might
I'll
check it out.
it's website, or I can email you a manuscript of it or
Yes.
whatever.
Yes, please. I love both of those franchises. That would be amazing. I'd love to see what you did with that idea.
Yeah, and granted, it's not going to go anywhere unless someone wants to buy the. I can't do anything with it due to rights and all that stuff. But it was just a fun thing to do, just to kind of get myself. It was good practice before going into the next to a real original story. And I was going to also next thing I was going to ask too is I know you had told me that Michael Jackson's Thriller was what really got you introduced to horror. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, I was little. I couldn't have been more than, I want to say 5 or 6. And my father used to have a record player in his little bar in the basement, and we were not allowed to touch it under any circumstances. So every day I used to go down there and touch it anyway, because that's what kids do. And I would steal Michael Jackson's Thriller and Meatloaf Bad Out of Hell. And I would play those two records over and over and over. I love them. Now, Halloween came that year, and it was the same year that Thriller came out. And when it came on TV, I remember being confused. I was like, I'm terrified, but I love it. Like I wasn't. I just knew watching that was where I needed to be. Wherever the scary stuff is where I
Mhm.
needed to be. And ever since then, I've been like intrigued by anything horror, macabre, like anything that holds that kind of sullen uh, obscureness to it.
Oh yeah, and I was 5 myself when I first discovered Dracula, the 1931 Bela Lugosi version, and I was hooked ever since. I just kind of worked my way up from all the old Universal pictures and into the Godzilla movies and some of the Hammer films, and and even now I'm still discovering old stuff I hadn't seen. I'm just last month I've been binge watching about every Giallo movie I can watch because I had up until I had never really watched too many of those, and yeah, so it's that's the fun thing about horror. There's so many different subgenres, and I'd be willing to bet. I bet you there's been more movies made in the horror genre than any other genre that I can think of. Can
Well,
think of anyone
gotta be.
if you think about how many are out there.
Well, I don't know. Action movies got a lot of movies. Rom-coms got quite a few, but I think horror has been the most consistent
Mm-hmm.
throughout the decades. It's changed up quite a bit. Like I find that horror back in the day used to be more of an existential thing. Like we would have like monsters and things that were outside of us and outside of our control, and these were the things that terrified us. And now, as we move into our day and age, it's more things like the purge, things that are hit a little bit more closer to home, things that seem a little bit more real, a little bit more tangible, that are scaring people now. So even when you take movies like Mama, right? It's that ultimate fear that we've discussed before about people fearing what can happen to their children, right? It's a very old concept, but they redo it in a new way. It's a lot of the monster movies, so it can't just be about the monster. It's got to be about the atmosphere as well. So you take things like Pan's Labyrinth, right? The Del Toro's creatures are second to none. And when you get into like anything past the 2000s, I find, like you said earlier, always has some kind of, the good ones anyway, always have some kind of social commentary to them, even if it's buried. And I mean, a lot of the old horror does too, but I find it's moving
Oh
itself
yeah.
more to the surface with the newer horror. Like it's becoming more on the nose than back in the day where we had things like Frankenstein and Frankenstein's monster, where it's almost the moral of the story is like, look at what we did to Frankenstein's monster and who's the real monster and yada, yada, yada. Now I think it's a little bit more on the nose with things like The Purge, where if you take away these things even for 24 hours, look at what people jump to, which I always thought was weird. If you told me all these things were legal for 24 hours, I mean, I don't know why everybody jumps to murder. I mean, there's so many other illegal things that you can do, like rob a bank or, steal a plane or something. Everybody jumps to murder, but I mean, I dig it, but it's one of those things that I find people hit really close to home because, like with the purge, everybody's always scared about a government overreach, right? And
Right.
that's kind of what it's based in, is that the government takes the new founding fathers, as they put in all these new rules, and now they have the purge, and this is something that you've got to live through every year, and it's because of government overreach. And now, when you go back and you look at things like, I don't know, Freddie, right? There's not a
Mm.
whole lot. There's not a whole lot of social commentary there. Well, not in all of them. I think what was it, Dream Warriors was actually pretty good. Had some more commentary, I think, than the rest of them.
Well, they also, well, even the second one, to this day, a lot of people, and I don't even know people even realized it back then. The second one had a lot of, I guess, gay connotations to it. It's been so long since I've seen the second
Yeah,
one,
me too.
which, which would have been, which is interesting if you go back to, oh, I think it was 1934, Dracula's Daughter. That movie, if you sit and watch it, there is plenty of bisexual, lesbian innuendo in that movie.
Well, all the
Is
vampire stuff.
oh yeah,
They're like, are they asexual anyway, right? So like when you look at
right.
Anne Rice's vampires, like,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, just look at Interview with a Vampire. The whole
Oh
thing is
yeah,
based on a
exactly.
gay relationship. Well, I mean, I guess it's, some people say it's open to interpretation, but for me, I mean,
I would
Louis and
say,
Lestat,
yeah,
and
they're
those,
getting it on.
they even adopted a little baby vampire thing. They were like, oh yeah, we have a daughter. This is great. No one seemed to put that together back then. I mean, I sure hope they don't put it together now, because some people would be really mad. But yeah, I find that in a lot of vampire stuff that it's one of the reasons that I like certain vampires, like 30 Days a Night, brilliant.
Mm-hmm. Great.
Blade, awesome. Twilight, when you
No.
over romanticize them, I find it kind of takes away from it. Bram Stoker's I really enjoyed, but I enjoyed the language of the story more
Mm-hmm.
than. But I do find that with vampires in general, they tend to over romanticize them. Which, I mean, you're already there. They're sucking on your neck. They're creeping through your bedroom window. I mean, it's already kind of there anyway. You don't just.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons why I went with this story. I'm doing a vampire story because I really wanted to. I always thought that the Hammer films of the '60s and early 70s nailed the perfect balance of uh, the vampires being both this mean, menacing bloodsucker thing, but also being very sexual and erotic at the same time. I thought they did a pretty good job, and that's what I'm kind of trying to do with this story here. And we'll
I
just say
feel
the vampires aren't necessarily going to be the main villains of this story. They're almost like they exist as a critique on humanity, we'll say.
Yeah, but that's the thing is I think that it's great when it can be balanced. I think
Mm-hmm.
vampires as a concept of the creature itself, I think is incredible. I just think that when you have things that come out one after the other where it's just over romanticized and over romanticized, like it just gets to be
Mm-hmm.
a lot. But like I said, 30 Days a Night was brilliant. I mean,
Oh
those
yeah,
vampires were awesome. Blade, those again,
John
incredible.
Carpenter's vampires. If you've seen
Yes,
that,
yes, absolutely. And that's, you have plenty of examples of great vampire stories. It's just when I mean Twilight is a perfect example of what I mean, but I don't want to harp on the
never
Twilight
seen
thing.
one. Never seen one of them.
I tried to read the books. I was on a long train ride, and one of my friends gave me the whole series, and they were like, "Here, you can read this while you're on the train." And I was like, "Well, I got nothing better to do. Might as well try it out." I had a 24-hour train ride, and I put down the first book within 45 minutes. I was like, "Yeah, I'd rather look out the window." So it was just too much for me. Too much like Betty and Veronica meets Bram Stoker. Like I was just wasn't interested. But it doesn't mean that the story is necessarily bad. I'm just looking for more of the horror than the romance.
Right.
So if you can blend them well, then I don't mind. It's like Anne Rice. There was a lot of romance in those stories, but I found that she did a really good job of showing how romantic they can be, and then in a flip, turning them into
How
like
brutal.
vicious killers. And that's the thing is she did a really good job of showing both sides. Where I find that some stories like Twilight, where they over romanticize them, they do
Mm-hmm.
try to show you, but they show you in a very PG way.
Yeah.
Like he runs up on you really fast and he gets really close and he's like, ah, right. And that's supposed to show you his power. And I'm just not buying it. I want to see him rip a face off a horse or something. You know what I mean? It's just, it,
Right.
it, but I do enjoy the classic monsters. I just find that it really depends on how they're done. Especially if you're going to take a classic idea like that and you're going to work with it, then at least they're monsters. Give them the credit that they're due. They're supposed to
Mm-hmm.
be scary.
Well, and that was something that drew me to Hellraiser when I first watched that. Pinhead, or as I like to call him, and how Clive Barker prefers to call him, the Hell Priest. Him and the Cenobites are not really the main villains of that story at all.
No,
It's really the human characters of Frank and Julia that are, and it's almost like a fairy tale with Julia being the wicked stepmother, which is even referenced in the second one that she's now the evil queen, and basically Kirsty is Snow White, more or less, in this whole, which to this day I think it's one of the most brilliantly written movies, and it's my favorite one, probably my favorite book, Hellbound Heart, when we're talking about books. But I think oftentimes in these movies, more times not, the monster or demon or vampire or werewolf are oftentimes metaphors, I think, for our own fears, our own insecurities, and through whoever the final girl, final guy is, we live vicariously through them. It's why Chief Brody is such a relatable character for me, because he's a guy who's out of his elements, which sometimes I feel like I am. He hates the water. I hate the water. I don't like going in the water. And the shark represents his own fears of overcoming that, basically.
yeah, horror's always been really good at that. That's why I say all the best horror always has that messaging behind it. You know what I mean? If it's something that's just straight up, I mean, for lack of a better word, just straight up gore porn, it's just doesn't hold any water for me. So movies like Hostel, for example,
Mm-hmm.
I watched them both. Had high hopes for them. I like the idea for the storyline, but it was just overdone. It was just too much gore, not enough story. And some things like Saw is a really good example of something that has a lot of gore, but an incredible story. Like,
Have you
and
seen
so
Saw X yet?
no, no, I haven't watched the newer ones. What was the last one? I think was it Saw 4 where they went into that house, right? Where they
Hmm.
were going around the rooms? Yeah, that was the last one that I seen, but I have a real phobia when it comes to needles. So when the girl was in that one room and they like pan
Oh
in
yeah.
on the hole in the ground, and I left the theater. I was like, nope, I know somebody's going in that hole. I can't. I was gonna. Nope, I couldn't do it. But it was the only time that I've ever left a movie theater for a horror movie. Was I when they panned in, all I could see was bits of yellow, and they
Mm.
panned in, and as they got closer, I just knew somebody's going in that hole. And from what everybody tells me, somebody did. But I was not there to see it. I couldn't.
Saw X, given that is the 10th entry of a series, has got to be the best late series movie that I've seen. I mean, it's easily it's my second favorite in the whole series behind the original. That's
My
how
favorite
good it
part.
was done. I mean, they weren't just making this. Just obviously, all movies are made to make money, but they really you could tell put an effort into the story, and it's probably Tobin Bell's best performance throughout that whole series.
Well, I'm gonna have to watch it then. I do take by recommendation, but once a franchise starts kind of on the decline, like I don't tend to take
Oh yeah,
to
I did not
binge
have
watch the
any.
rest of them.
I had no expectations for it. Maybe that's why I liked it so much. But lots of other people have said the same thing that it's definitely in the top two or three in that series. So
Nice. I'm gonna have something to do once we're done with our interview then.
no kidding. So what do you think about the state of horror now? I'm gathering you're probably a few years younger than me, but we're mainly both Gen Xers. We've seen all the movies from the 70s, grew up in the 80s, 90s. Nowadays, what do you think about the state of horror movies now?
Um, I mean, it's always been I mean, for me with horror, it's always been a matter of like people say, "Oh, there's so many horror movies that suck." And I'm like, that is absolutely true. There's a whole lot of them that are absolutely terrible, but when you find the good ones, they're really, really good. Um, and like I was saying earlier, I think that a lot of horror now is more of a societal reflection. We see it in a lot of examples in newer horror movies where people are the thing to be afraid of, right? So even if
Mm-hmm.
you take like The Walking Dead, for example, in the beginning of the series, it's all about the zombies and how we're going to survive the zombies and being afraid of the zombies. As we progress along, they start to realize that the zombies were never the thing that they had to be afraid of. It was the other survivors that were eventually going to be the problem. And I think that in a lot of newer horror, we see that same idea mirrored in different ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, one thing's for sure, horror's definitely in a better shape than other genres. The comedy genre, me and Kathleen were talking about this last week, it's dead. Outside of going to, I mean, stand up comedies off the charts, but as far as movies go, I can't remember the last really great comedy movie that there's been. And I think even the superhero genre, I think, is on its way out. It's certainly going downhill, I think.
I've always been a fan of comic books too, and this has just killed me. There's been so many comic book remakes, and while I was a fan of them, it just got to be overkill. You know, they did such a good job with Blade, and that really opened the door
Hmm.
for them to make the rest of them. But again, Blade was part of the horror genre. So
Exactly.
the reason it did so well is because all the horror fans wanted to see it. This is a comic that we were all well aware of and that we all
Hmm.
wanted to see made into a live action movie. Wesley Snipes did an amazing job. Um, but as far as other genres are concerned, I don't. I gotta be completely honest with you. I don't watch anything but horror. So even like
Hmm.
comedies and stuff like that. To me, the reason I don't watch comedy movies, rom coms, action movies is they're very plotted and they all follow they're saying their own formula, right?
Hmm.
So action movies, good guy is not so good, he's renegade, whatever, and then he has a falling out with someone that he really cares about, and then they become in danger, and then he's got to face all these obstacles to try to save them, and in the end, he saves them. Now, whether that be his wife, his dog, his daughter, regardless, it's all kind of the same thing. Romantic comedy is the same thing. A guy is an asshole, meets simple girl that changes his mind, and then simple girl doesn't want him, so he's got to change his whole thing to meet up with simple girl, and then simple girl finally realizes he's been there the whole time now that he's changed everything about himself, and they live happily ever after. But it gets monotonous to watch the same basic plot over and over again.
Well, it's interesting because like the best action films have been ones that probably had horror elements to them.
Yeah,
I've always
absolutely.
argued that the original Terminator is
Yes,
basically a sci-fi slasher film
yes,
without
absolutely.
question. All you have to do is watch the original Halloween or watch any Friday the 13th movie you want to, particularly ones with Kane Hodder, and then watch Terminator and tell me that's not a slasher film.
But yeah, I will argue with you that the original Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory was a horror movie.
Oh,
I
without question.
Yeah,
Without question.
people look at me like I'm crazy. I'm like, he was completely willing to stand there and watch these kids die. Like, you ever noticed Gene Wilder was not concerned at
Nope.
all. He was like, oh no, please stop. Like, I don't know where anybody could not see that as a horror movie, but I remember being a kid and being like, I love this movie, and not because it was Candyland, whatever, Chocolate Factory. It was because I wonder who's going to die next. How are they going to die? They're going to fall into a hole. They're going to become a blueberry. They're going to fall into a chocolate river. Who knows? All we know is that the Oompa Loompas are going to come and take them away, and we're never going to hear from them again.
And those things are freaky. I mean,
Crazy.
Cenobites, Michael Myers, Jason does not scare me, but those orange little munchkin things I don't want to look at.
And then
Them and the old Burger King mascot freaks me out, but
oh yeah, with a big giant head. I know, me too. That
it's the only
other
thing
one.
that scares me.
But it's weird how you can take movies like that, and some people don't consider them horror, and some people do. Like for me, when I was a kid, the Never Ending Story, The Nothing,
Hmm.
horrifying. Like when I was a kid, it's a great movie, and I get it's made for kids, but there were parts of it that were just horrifying to me, and I always loved it because of that. Like when you mix fantasy and horror, that's my favorite. When you like
Dark
when you
Crystal's another one.
Oh, Pan's Labyrinth was incredible. The Labyrinth with David Bowie, incredible. He
Hmm.
steals the baby and wants to make him into a goblin. I thought it was great. I, but that's it. These movies, like back in the 80s, especially, there was always that little touch of scary to these fantasy movies. Just not enough to give you nightmares, but enough to make you uncomfortable as a kid.
Well, I'll tell
That
you
was
what, the only creature that's ever given me any nightmares has been the predator.
really.
Yes,
Oh,
because I will sometimes get a dream or nightmare of me running through a jungle and this predator is chasing me because you know what he's going to do to you. He's going to rip your spine and skull out and do whatnot. And that's always been the one that's really the only nightmare of any movie character I've ever had.
yeah, I don't. There's been a couple. I've seen some incredible and like very imaginative creatures are always the way to get me. I will always watch a Del Toro movie.
Hmm.
I don't think he does great on every movie he does, but I will
Right.
always give it a shot. But there's another one. What was it? Channel Zero. Do you ever watch that show?
I haven't seen it, no.
Oh, so they've got some really good creatures. I highly recommend it. There's a couple of seasons of it. There's one in particular called The Dream Door because it's almost like an anthology as well, but each season is a different story. And I think you can find it on like Prime and Sci-Fi and Shutter, but
Hmm.
definitely worth looking into as far as horror TV series are concerned. But they have a really interesting creature on one of those that's just made of teeth. Like it's just the whole like it's like a body
Wow.
suit that's just like made of teeth, and the sound that it makes when it moves, just very unsettling. The whole thing, but definitely worth checking out if you haven't yet.
Okay. It's hard for me to get into television series anymore because it means I have to invest a lot more time watching them rather than a 90-minute or 120-minute movie. I would say, getting back to where horror is. Like I said, it's in better shape than most genres. I think the
Mhm.
only thing I have a hard time, and this is more of a me problem, I think, is these horror movies that feature teenage or 20 something kids in them. I just can't relate to. Oh man, I'm going to be 50 in a couple of months, but not in the way I could relate to the younger characters in the 70s and 80s. I could relate to those obviously because I grew up in that time, but when you're talking about modern, I just watched Eli Roth's Thanksgiving last night. And it's
Oh,
a
don't
good
tell me, I
movie.
haven't watched it yet. I'm looking forward to it.
It's a good movie, but I could not stand any of these teenagers. I'm like, kill every single one of them, please, please. I
That's
just
funny.
could.
When I was a teenager and Scream came out, I was still cheering for Ghostface to kill all the teenagers, and I was a teenager back then. I as far as the teenagers are concerned, that's been an ongoing thing in horror movies, and I think the reason is because adults, for the most part, have too much logic, right? It doesn't make for a great movie if they're like, grab the gun and call the cops instead of let's go running in the woods this way, right? So you need that little bit of a lack of logic in order to progress the story sometimes. I think it's easier to do with teenagers.
Yeah, it's why one thing in my writing, I'm obviously focusing on my main characters being like in their 40s or 30s or something. I don't think I could write for a young character anymore. Maybe I could let my daughter or son write. Here, can you write for this character for me real quick? I'll give you writing
I
credit on it.
I have 2 teenagers, so every time I wanna know, like, what would a teenager say in this situation, I
Hmm.
just go and say what my character would say to my son, and then
Right.
I see what his reaction is. And I'm like, "Alright, thank you very much." And he'll be like, "What was that about?" And I'm "It's fine, don't worry about it." Uh, but I do have some source reference material living with me in my house, so that makes it a little bit easier, but, if they were older, I feel like, writing for example so when I started the book, Gabe and Lou
Hmm.
are the same ages that my kids were.
Right.
Um, and Lou, my daughter's name is Marilyn, but we call her Lulu as her
Okay.
nickname. So that's where that came from. Now, does Lou look anything like my daughter? Absolutely not. My daughter's blonde hair, blue eyes, beautiful little thing. But um, the inspiration for the name came from that. And when it comes to writing younger characters, it makes it a lot easier when I have 2 kids that are like no holes barred and will tell me exactly what they think. They know when I talk to them that I'm looking for an honest answer coming from an honest place, not because I want to get you in trouble, but they know, "Oh, are you writing again, mom?" Like, "Yeah, that's why I'm asking." So it's helpful to have them around.
Yeah, I have a 15 and a 13-year-old myself, so yeah, I know how that goes.
That's
Um,
funny. That's exactly what I have is a 15 and a 13-year-old.
oh, really? Is it a boy and girl or
It
boy,
is.
girl, girl?
It is. It's a boy. My older one's a boy. My younger one's a girl.
Vice versa. My oldest one's the daughter and youngest one's the son. So
I always like to think my life would have been so much easier if that was the case, but somehow I feel like
ours
it
would have
was
been, but they're like only a year and a half apart. So it's almost like he's so tall. He's taller than his sister, taller than his mom, and he's catching up on me next. So it's like,
Yeah, it's same here. My son's like 6'6", 6'7", something like that. Like he's really, really
oh
tall.
wow.
Yeah, I only come up to
So
his shoulders.
are your kids like into? Have they followed your footsteps as at least being fans of horror?
Oh yeah, definitely. As far as
Mm,
fans of horror, yeah.
yeah,
As far as reading, not so much. But
right.
yeah, my daughter is definitely picking up in my footsteps when it comes to being a fan of all things macabre and all things
Hmm.
scary. My son does too. Not as much as my daughter does, but he definitely is following the same kind of footsteps. But living in my house, there's only so far you can go to escape it too. It's everywhere in my house, so I get to get with it eventually.
Yeah, my son's definitely the big horror movie. He's gotten big into those, and whereas my daughter's not as much in the movies, but she's more into reading the books. So I've got that going on. So, in fact, me and my son went to a horror convention in Colorado last year. So, got to get some autographs and meet some people, and he had a lot of fun doing that. Have
Yeah,
they do that? I assume they have horror conventions up there in Montreal, being a pretty big city.
They do. They do. The last one I think only came through a couple of years ago. I don't think there was one. I think there's been one since COVID, and I
Hmm.
think that the last one before that was before, like, pre-COVID. So,
Okay.
I think we have one coming up this summer, but I'd have to check that again. Or maybe I was just going to Toronto. Have to check it again. But yeah, we do have them come through here and there, but not as often as you would think in Montreal. I think it's because we have a lot of French readers here, and not
Okay.
a whole lot of books are translated. But I know that they have a big one in Toronto every year that I'm going to try to get down to here in the next couple of years.
Yeah, my wife and I were going to one in Las Vegas next month. So
Oh, nice.
yeah, yeah, and they got some good ones. I mean, I just mentioned her, Ashley Lawrence, who played Kirsty in Hellraiser, will be there. Felicia Rose, who was in Sleepaway Camp. Dee Wallace will be there from Cujo.
Nice.
Um, yeah, Kane Hodder will be there, and a lot of the people from Aliens and Pet Cemetery will be there as well. So it should be a pretty good showing.
Sounds exciting, Cujo. I screamed through that whole movie at that poor woman. I just had to
Yeah,
scream for the whole time.
she
Like, just
literally
kick
went
the
through
dog.
hell.
Get something, kick the dog, hit the dog, do something. I was just screaming the whole time. After it was done, I was like, I'm never watching that again. Never again. I was so mad.
I really, and that's one thing too. And I've met some of the, some of these celebrities who've made these movies, and they are just the ones I've interacted with have been some of the most down to earth, nicest people you'll ever meet. Which is
Yeah. Well, I mean, they got good fans, right? The horror community is, I mean, we're a bunch of freaks and weirdos, but we're harmless. Like,
right.
we enjoy so much the darker side of humanity that I think that it's easier for us to get back to the light than the people that kind of sit in the middle. Like, they sit in that
Hmm.
gray area their whole lives, where we'll
Yeah.
venture all the way into the dark just to come back into the light, and it makes it easier for us to recognize the
Hmm.
difference between the two.
Well, our genre, our fans are probably definitely one of the most passionate fan bases, I think, in any genre. I mean, obviously, Star Wars fans are nuts, and I like Star Wars, but I stay the hell away from any Facebook Star Wars group because they will just slit each other's throat left and right normally. But in horror, and I think you're right, I think we explore the dark so it helps us get through the darkness in our own lives oftentimes or what's going on. A lot of people would say that during COVID that it was us horror fans that were able to acclimate, or if that's even a word, we were
Acclimate,
able
yeah.
to the to the what was going on a lot better than non-horror fans because like I said, we're used to it. We're like, oh, this is no big deal. This just
Yeah.
means we get to spend more time at home watching movies then. Yeah.
Well, as far as I'm concerned, as long as the purge ain't going on outside, we're fine.
Yeah, yeah,
All
I was okay. All of a sudden, I have to work from home. Okay, I don't have to go
okay.
into office and talk with other people. Good. Uh,
All right. Twist my rubber arm. And that's the thing. I didn't have much of a problem with COVID either, for the simple fact that it gave me more time to write. So, I mean, stick me in a room with a pad of paper, like, I'm good for at least 2 days.
so when do you think your next book will be out? Book two of this series.
That's a good question. I'm hoping for next year, so 2025.
Okay.
Um, that's the plan right now. Now, like we were talking about earlier, depending on what my characters decide to do,
Mm-hmm.
uh, that's the plan, is to have it finished by the end of this year and start the editing process early next year. So hopefully, again, we should see it around September.
Excellent, excellent. Um, Getting way back to talk about self-publishing, which I've done the same thing, mainly because no one. I sent the script to or manuscript to publishers, never heard back from them, and said, "Well, I'm just going to do this myself." What obstacles? What do you think is the most difficult part of self-publishing? For me, it's
Um,
the promotion and marketing, but
the promotion is was more than I was ready for. I can say that. The rest of it I find actually to be really easy. I didn't go with a publisher. I didn't go with an agent because I didn't want, I mean, it might be my ego talking here, but I wanted the story to be what I wanted it to be. I didn't want
Hmm.
anyone to come in and say, "Oh, you should change the cover, or you should change what this character's doing, or you should write this character this way," or anything like
Ex-
that. I knew what I wanted. I knew how I wanted it to end up, and I knew what I wanted to put out. So I knew also by taking on any of those type of positions that before I could prove what I was worth because I was a debut author, that they were
hmm.
just gonna I was probably just gonna get steamrolled into what they wanted me
Right.
to do. So I figured I'll put out the first book, I'll see how it does. And potentially I might approach some people for the second book, but I wanted the story to be established so they wouldn't be able to veer off course from what I've already
Exactly.
established. So that was more my reason for going with that type of publishing because there was some discussion before that, but nothing was going in the direction that I really wanted it to go. And a lot of people were concerned about how the story was going to be viewed by the public and how
Oh
this
yeah.
could offend this person and this could offend that person and we need trigger warnings for this and trigger warnings for that. And I didn't want to do any of that. I didn't want to tone down the book. I didn't want to make it so no one would get offended. I didn't want to change my personal opinions to suit what the publisher
Hmm.
would want from the story. So that was off the table for the first one. Like I said, I might consider it for the second one, depending on who says what, because that the
Right.
first time around didn't go so well.
Yeah, I think one thing I'm going to start doing, I'm going to get some order a bunch of author copies for myself, and we have a couple local bookstores here in town that will actually sell books for local authors. So I'm going to go that route, and then maybe after I get my second book out, I'll probably start buying like vendor or renting out vendor spaces at these horror cons. I figured that would be a good way because I've seen other authors, independent authors, do the same thing. So that might be something I might do, at least places within driving range of or driving distance of where I live, because I'm like in between. Like here's Amarillo, here's Denver, here's Dallas, here's Albuquerque and Oklahoma City, and then everything in between.
I'm about halfway there. I just got copies and left them in random places, like on the bus, in church,
Hmm.
random
Yeah.
places. I just figure somebody will pick it up. Maybe they'll read it. Maybe they'll throw it in the trash. Maybe they'll give it to somebody else. I mean, but if you see a book sitting on the bus and it looks brand new, I mean, I'd pick it up.
That's not a bad idea. I may have to consider doing that. I actually did something on Slasher, and for our audience who don't know yet, Slasher is a social media site just strictly
Awesome.
for horror.
Yeah.
But I ran a contest about a month ago or so where I said, okay, here's like 10 movie quiz questions. Whoever answers them all 10 correctly first, I'll send you a copy of my book. Because right now I don't necessarily care about the money at this point. I just want the books out there and being read.
Yeah. And that makes sense. I mean, I think that's what we all want is just people to read it. I don't care if I get, like, the plan was never to get rich. You know what I mean? The
Right.
plan was never to become Stephen King or
Right.
something like that. I just wanted to speak my piece. I
Mm-hmm.
wanted to give my contribution to the horror world. And I wanted it to be a meaningful contribution. So if I can get this done before I die, then
Right.
I'll be happy with the fact that I made my contribution. But some I would like people to read it just for the simple fact that I would like the message behind the book to get out more than anything else.
Exactly.
I just need people to start like understanding that no matter what situation we find ourselves in, we're going to be in this together. All of us, regardless of who you pray to, who you vote for, anything like that. The biggest thing we can do is try to rely on each other as much as we can, instead of relying on everybody who's trying to control where we end up. And in the book, that's pretty much what it is.
Yeah, and that's another part I liked about that book. It's a book that people should read as if anything, as a cautionary tale, if anything. Um, So, so Kerri, you have anything else you'd like to add or ask before we end this session tonight?
No, this has been a lot of fun. I do want to say, everybody who's seen this is my book. Go get it. It's on Amazon. Raptured. It's the first book in a 5-book series. So, if you want to get ahead of the game and be able to keep up with the story as it goes along, get out and get your first copy now.
Exactly. In fact, I will put a link to that book here in the comment section or in the video description, so you can follow. And you also have a website too, don't you?
I do, I do. It's you can find me in different places. So you can find me on TikTok at the Afterworld series. You can find me on Facebook. There's the Afterworld series group. It's the same for X and Slasher. You can find me at KL Scary. As far as the website, www.theafterworldseries.ca.
Excellent. Yeah, and like I said, if people, well, you should always read more than one book in a year. But if you only read one book this year, read Raptured right here. But if you decide to read a second one, then you might want to check out my book, Hangman of Darkness, which is also available on Amazon as well.
And everybody should always read two, at least 2 books in a year. And that should be those two.
I tell you what, in this last year since I started writing, most of the stuff I read normally was like biographies, historical stuff. I never read a whole lot of fiction. I've probably read more fiction this past year in between writing than I have my previous 48 years on this earth. So
I've
it's
been reading a lot of anthologies because I only have time for the short stories, right?
right.
So it gives me like a minute. I can read like a 10-15 page story, put the bookmark in it, and the next time I come back, even if I don't remember what happened in that story, then I can start a whole fresh story. So I've been reading through a lot of anthologies recently.
I read your book back and forth on a plane trip that I took in December around Christmas time. I read almost half of it going to where I was going, and then the other half coming back. Well, I finished up the last couple chapters when I got home, but that was yours was a
Well,
pretty. I mean,
I'm
for us,
glad you liked it, man. I'm really
yeah, it
good
was.
that somebody enjoyed it.
Yeah. So, anyhow, well, thank you for joining us tonight, Kerri. We look forward to seeing your next book, and we will certainly have you on again if you'd like. So,
Oh, I can't wait. You'll hear from me when the second book comes out for sure.
I bet. Okay. Well, good night, everyone, and we'll see you in a couple weeks for our next episode. Thank you.